At the age of 78, Billy Crystal is still remembered as one of the greatest comedy icons of America, a man who has spent more than 4 decades redefining the way audiences perceive humor, wit, and emotion on stage. He is not only the star of classic films like When Harry Met Sally, a work that has become the gold standard of the romantic comedy genre, but also a familiar face on American television, especially with his role as host of the Academy Awards 9 times, an achievement that very few artists have accomplished, where he turned a formal ceremony into a vibrant entertainment experience with creative opening numbers, sharp ad-lib lines, and an almost perfect ability to connect with the audience. He has won many prestigious awards, including Emmy Awards for special programs and television contributions, a Tony Award for Broadway theater, and the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, one of the highest honors for comedians in the United States, recognizing not only his talent, but also his profound cultural influence. In the eyes of the public, Billy Crystal is the embodiment of grace, intelligence, and resilience. A person who does not need scandals or noise to maintain his position, but only talent and sincerity to survive in a constantly changing Hollywood. But behind all those achievements is a life in which laughter has never been enough to completely cover the deep voids. From the time he lost his father at the age of 15, he learned to face pain with humor as a way to keep himself from collapsing, and the more successful he became, the more he realized that fame could not bring the peace he had once sought. The years standing in front of millions of audiences could not replace the silent moments when he was alone, remembering those who had left, especially his close friend, Robin Williams, whose departure was not just a loss, but a deep cut into the part of himself that Billy rarely revealed. And then at the age of 78, as the stage lights gradually dimmed, he continued to live, not with the glory of the past, but with a quiet will, an acceptance that life is not about keeping laughter alive forever, but about learning to keep moving forward even when there is no one left to laugh with him. Before we dive deeper into this story, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a small way to honor the man who has spent his entire life making the world smile. But to understand why, at the age of 78, Billy Crystal sits in such long silence, we must go back to a completely different place, a time when his laughter had not yet echoed far, but was just small sounds trying to break through in a house that was both warm and fragile in Long Beach, New York, where he was born into a Jewish family deeply connected to jazz music, where the songs were not just entertainment but almost the breath of the entire family. His father, Jack Crystal, was a man who lived among records, recording sessions, conversations about art, a person who carried a great passion for music but never really held stability in life. The record store he ran was once a gathering place for many artists, a space filled with sound and hope, but behind that were numbers that never really balanced. Money that came and went, good days mixed with days full of anxiety, and Billy, when he was still a little boy, did not understand all of that. But he felt it. He felt the change in the air, the times when the house became more tense than usual, the times when the adults stayed silent a little longer, the times when his father's smile was no longer as complete as before. And it was in those moments that little Billy began to do the only thing he could think of to keep everything from falling apart. He imitated other people's voices, retold stories in a funnier way, made strange expressions just to see his mother's smile, just to bring back a little light into the room that was gradually darkening because of pressures that could not be named. It was not a conscious choice, but a reflex. A very natural way of a child when realizing that laughter could soothe something he was not old enough to understand. And over time, that became a part of who he was, not like a talent, but like a need, a way to exist in a world where everything always had the risk of being lost. That house, with jazz music playing from the record player, with the laughter of the family, with dreams bigger than reality, had nurtured something very special in Billy, a sensitivity to other people's emotions, an ability to recognize when someone needed comfort even if they did not say it. And he learned to become the one who brought that, not with advice, but with laughter, with gentleness, by making everything feel lighter even if only for a few minutes. But in that process, something else was also quietly forming. He began to tie his own value to the ability to make others happy, began to believe that if he stopped doing that, if he no longer brought laughter, then perhaps he would no longer be noticed, no longer be loved in the way he needed. And that was a belief that would follow him for many years later, when the stages became bigger, when the audience was no longer family but millions of strangers. But the feeling inside remained the same. Still the little boy standing in the house in Long Beach, trying to keep everything from collapsing with a smile, a line, a short, humorous moment. No one at that time realized that what was being created was not only a comedian, but a person who would spend his entire life bringing joy to others, while he himself always had to learn to live with an insecurity that never completely disappeared, a fear that everything good could leave at any moment, just like the way the peaceful days in that house were always so fragile that only a small change was enough to make the atmosphere different. And therefore, Billy did not only grow up in music, he grew up in the fragility of life, in the feeling that joy needed to be held on to, needed to be created, needed to be protected, because if not, it could disappear before you even realized it. And perhaps, right from there, his journey began, not as a choice to pursue art, but as a way to hold on to the most precious things before they drifted away forever. And then one day, all the fragility in that house was no longer just a feeling, it became reality when the man who kept everything together suddenly disappeared from Billy Crystal's life. His father passed away when he was just 15 years old, with no warning, no preparation, no final conversation to say the things that should have been said, only a void that appeared too quickly, too cold, leaving the whole family unable to understand what had happened. It was not a slow departure that gave people time to accept it, but a sudden cut, as if a part of the world was taken away in just one moment. And for Billy, it was not only losing his father, but losing the only anchor he had never realized he depended on so much. Because, until then, no matter how difficult life was, no matter how unstable the money was, there was always a man there, the one who brought music, brought voice, brought the feeling that everything would be okay. And when that person was no longer there, everything not only became quieter, but became strange, as if the house he once knew was no longer the same place. The rooms were still there, the objects were still there, but the atmosphere had changed. The conversations became shorter, the laughter became rarer, and there were silences that stretched so long that no one knew what to fill them with. His mother had to face the new reality. His siblings tried to adapt in their own ways. And Billy, at an age when a child still needed guidance, had to face a feeling that even adults found hard to name. That was a loss that could never be reversed. He had no chance to prepare for it. No one told him that this was going to happen. No one taught him how to deal with the fact that someone he loved could disappear forever. And because of that, the pain did not come like a wave and then recede. It stayed, smoldering, silent, but never disappeared. It crept into the way he saw the world, the way he saw people, and most importantly, the way he saw relationships. From that moment, Billy began to understand that everything could be lost at any time, that nothing was certain, that the people he loved could leave before he could say goodbye. And that thought, although not always clearly present, always existed somewhere inside him, like an echo that never ended. There were days when he tried to continue as normal, going to school, talking, joking, but underneath it all, a part of him had changed forever. A part that became more vigilant, more sensitive, always waiting for something bad to happen. And that sensitivity would later become part of his talent. But at that time, it was simply a burden that a 15-year-old boy should not have to carry. He began to observe the people around him more closely, noticing small changes in their voices, in their eyes, as if trying to predict what might happen, so he would not be caught off guard again. But no matter how hard he tried, the truth did not change, that there were things he could not control, losses he could not prevent, and questions that would never have answers. That pain did not turn him into a person who collapsed immediately, but turned him into someone who carried it throughout his life. A wound that did not bleed but always existed, affecting the way he chose, the way he loved, the way he worked, and the way he faced success later. Because when you have lost the most important thing too early, everything else, no matter how big, could never completely fill that void. And perhaps right from that day, Billy Crystal was no longer a child. He became a person learning to live with a new reality, a reality where laughter was no longer just joy, but gradually became a way to keep himself from being overwhelmed by what he had lost. And from that unfillable void, Billy Crystal did not choose to remain silent forever. He chose a different path, a path that at first glance seemed completely opposite to what he was carrying in his heart, that was to turn to comedy as a way to confront his own emotions, not because he thought he had special talent, but because it was the only thing that had ever helped him keep everything from falling apart when he was young. And now, when the pain had grown bigger, he returned to it like a survival instinct, starting from small stages, crowded bars, where the lights were not bright enough and the audience was not always listening, where every line could fall into silence if it did not reach someone. But Billy still stood there, night after night, experimenting, observing, adjusting, learning to read the room, learning to make others laugh with just the right line at the right time. And in those rare moments when the whole room laughed together, he felt something very different. As if in a few short seconds, the pain inside him eased, not disappearing, but receding, giving way to a lighter, easier feeling. Those very moments kept him going, made him believe that if he could make others laugh, he could also keep himself from collapsing completely, and over time, laughter was no longer just the audience's reaction. It became a structure, a system he built around himself so he did not have to face directly what he had lost. On stage, he was quick, smart, full of energy. Every story told had rhythm, had a climax, had a subtlety that made listeners feel close, but none of them saw the rest. The part that did not appear under the lights, the part where, after the show ended, when the audience left and the laughter gradually faded, he returned to himself, to the thoughts that no one was there to hear, to the memories that could not be erased. A paradox began to form. The more he made others laugh, the more he had to hide, because when people saw him as a source of joy, they did not look for sadness there. They did not ask the difficult questions, and that created an invisible distance between his true self and the image the world saw. Billy gradually got used to keeping two versions of himself existing in parallel, one on stage, full of light and laughter, and one in real life, quieter, more contemplative, carrying things he never spoke about. That habit did not form in one day. It was built through each performance, each time he chose a joke instead of a truthful word, each time he felt that if he stopped making others laugh, he might have to face emotions he was not ready for. And so he continued, not only for his career, but because it was the only way he knew to keep himself moving forward. But the price of it was something he had to learn to accept over time, that when you spend too much time making others happy, you may forget how to speak up when you are not okay. That when you always appear with a smile, people will think you do not need comfort. And Billy, though he did not say it, gradually understood that the laughter he created could fill the room. But it did not always fill the voids inside himself, and that was a truth he would carry for a very long time. Even when the stages became bigger, when the audiences became larger, when his name began to be mentioned more, because somewhere deep inside, he was still that boy from back then, the one who had learned to use a funny story to keep his world from collapsing and continued to do so, not because he wanted to become a star, but because he needed to survive. But even when Billy Crystal began to find a little foothold on those small stages, the journey ahead of him did not open up like a straight path, but like a long series of doors closing before any door would open. The early years of his career passed in obscurity, with small roles, insignificant opportunities, appearances where even when they ended no one remembered his name. Hollywood at that time was not short of funny people, not short of new faces, and Billy was just one of many trying to squeeze into an industry that had no room for hesitation or slowness. He went to auditions, was rejected, then went to auditions again, took roles that sometimes lasted only a few minutes, roles that if cut from the film no one would notice what was lost. And there were times when, even though he had done his part well, the opportunities still did not continue to come, as if there was an invisible gap between him and what people called being recognized. He worked non-stop, moving from one stage to another, from one television show to another, always keeping himself busy, always continuing to speak, continuing to perform, continuing to make others laugh. But underneath all that movement was a feeling that was very hard to name, the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something bigger but never really stepping into it, as if he could see the light but never touch it. There were nights when he left the stage with no one coming to congratulate him, no one remembering his performance. The laughter rang out and then disappeared without a trace. And he returned home carrying the same question he did not say to anyone, whether he really belonged here or not, whether all these efforts would lead to anything or just an endless loop of trying and disappointment. In an industry where attention was everything, not being noticed was not just a state, but a feeling that could erode confidence little by little, making people start to doubt themselves. And Billy, no matter how strong he was, could not avoid those moments when he wondered if he was pursuing something that was not meant for him, if what he was doing really had meaning or was just scattered efforts that never connected into something bigger. But what made him different was not that he did not feel those doubts, but the way he faced them. He did not stop, did not leave the stage, did not choose an easier path, but continued to move forward, continued to appear, continued to tell his stories to anyone willing to listen, even if it was just a small group of audience in a dark room. Because somewhere inside him there still existed a very small belief, not big enough to dispel all the doubts, but enough for him not to give up completely. And perhaps the hardest thing in this period was not the lack of success, but the lack of validation. No one told him that he was going in the right direction. There was no clear sign that everything he was doing would lead to something bigger. Only time passing and similar days following one another. And in that repetition, many people chose to stop, but Billy did not. He continued, not because he was sure he would succeed, but because he did not know any other way to live except continuing to tell stories, continuing to stand in front of people and turn small things into laughter. And even though no one said it, even though there was no title recognizing it, even though his name had not appeared in the positions he once dreamed of, he was still building something, little by little, through each appearance, through each story told, through each moment he chose to stay instead of leaving. And it was those overlooked years, those years when the world did not pay attention to him, that were the time quietly shaping the person that everyone would later know, a person who not only knew how to make others laugh, but also knew how to keep moving forward, even when no one saw him. And then, after those nearly invisible years, the door that Billy Crystal had patiently knocked on finally began to crack open, not with an immediate explosion, but with small opportunities that gradually grew, appearances on television that began to be noticed more, especially when he joined programs with a wider audience reach, where his charm and storytelling ability were for the first time recognized as something different. His role in soap brought him closer to the public, not only because of the humor, but also because of the way he brought depth to his character, making audiences not only laugh, but also feel something more real behind the lines. And from there, his name began to be mentioned more. Invitations appeared more often. Opportunities that before seemed to always slip from his hands now began to stay longer. He stepped onto bigger stages, appeared in front of larger audiences, and for the first time, the feeling that he was being seen was no longer distant. But even when the light began to shine on him, what he carried from before did not disappear at all. The pain from losing his father, the years of being overlooked, the feeling of uncertainty about his place in this world, all of it was still there. It was just that now they were covered by a layer of external success. There was one thing that few people realized, that when you have gotten used to living in absence, then even when you start to have more, you still do not completely believe that it will stay. Billy began to experience that. He worked harder, appeared more, tried to hold on to every opportunity as if it could disappear at any time, because deep inside he still carried the fear that everything he had was only temporary, that at any moment everything could go back to the way it was before, where he was not seen, not remembered. Fame brought him the recognition he had waited for so long, but it did not bring the peace he once thought he would have. Because peace does not come from others knowing you, but from feeling okay with yourself. And that was what Billy was still searching for, even when he stood in front of more people than ever. There were moments when he realized that the audience's laughter was not completely the same as the laughter in the house years ago, where he once tried to make his mother smile because their laughter was a way to keep the family from collapsing, while here it was part of the job, a response he had learned to create precisely, a skill he had honed over many years, and that very difference sometimes made him feel distant from the very thing that had brought him here. He began to understand that success was not the end point of the journey, but only another stage where the old questions did not disappear but only changed shape, from "will I be recognized" to "is all of this enough?" And the answer, though he did not say it, still never seemed to be a certainty. He continued to work, continued to move forward, because that was the only thing he knew, but now he carried not only hope, but also the awareness that fame and attention could not replace what he had lost, could not erase the memories that were deeply imprinted in him, and could not guarantee that the people he loved would always be there. And that very awareness made his journey more complex, deeper, because he was no longer pursuing success as an answer, but as part of a longer journey, where he was still trying to understand what truly mattered, even when the whole world began to say that he had it all. And then, when everything seemed to converge at the right time, Billy Crystal stepped into a phase where the world could no longer ignore him, a phase where his name not only appeared on television, but was also deeply imprinted in the cultural memory of America, especially when he joined the film When Harry Met Sally, a work that was not only commercially successful, but also became a symbol of the way people perceive love, friendship, and seemingly ordinary conversations that contain profound truths about life. And in the role of Harry Burns, Billy did not just act. He lived in that character, bringing into every line a sincerity that made audiences feel as if they were hearing their own thoughts being spoken. The film took him to a new height, where he was no longer a face trying to find a foothold, but an indispensable part of Hollywood, a person whose mere appearance brought trust, a promise that audiences would laugh, would feel, would connect. And from there he became a familiar face at major events, especially the Academy Awards, where he not only hosted the show but turned an entire formal ceremony into a vibrant space where the biggest stars in the world also had to burst into laughter at his charm and intelligence. He hosted the show multiple times, each time bringing memorable moments, creative opening numbers, ad-libbed lines that made audiences feel like they were participating in a conversation rather than simply watching a ceremony. And gradually, he was regarded as one of the best hosts in the history of the event, an unofficial title but widely recognized by both the public and the industry. But right when he reached that peak, another pressure also quietly formed. Not the pressure to succeed anymore, but the pressure to never be allowed to fail in the eyes of others. The pressure to always maintain the image that people had become familiar with. The image of someone who was always quick-witted, always humorous, always had the right answer at the right time. And that, over time, became a role that never ended. A role he could not step out of even when the lights had gone out. There were moments when he felt tired, not because the work was too much, but because of always having to keep himself in a certain state, always having to be ready to make others laugh, even when there was nothing to laugh about inside him. But he could not allow that to be seen. Because the world did not come to him to see weakness. They came to him to be relieved, to forget their own difficulties. And so he continued to deliver what they expected, even if that meant he had to keep other parts of himself in silence. Gradually, the boundary between his true self and the public image blurred, not because he did not know who he was, but because he had gotten used to putting others' needs first, used to becoming what people needed rather than who he really was, and that created a void that not everyone noticed. A void between the laughter he created and what he felt when no one was around. Success brought him everything he had once searched for: recognition, stability, a position in the industry. But it also brought something else, a very particular kind of loneliness, not the absence of people around him, but the lack of space to truly be himself. Because when the whole world looks at you in a certain way, changing that image, even for a moment, becomes much more difficult. And so Billy continued to walk in the light, continued to make millions laugh, continued to become a symbol of something bigger than himself, while inside he still carried questions that no stage could answer, emotions that no audience was allowed to see, and a truth he gradually understood, that no matter how great the successes were, they could not help a person escape from themselves, could not erase what had shaped them from very early on, and could not replace the things they truly needed but never spoke about. While the stage lights continued to shine on Billy Crystal with increasing intensity, there was one thing in his life that had never been allowed to waver, that was his marriage to Janice Goldfinger, the woman who had been by his side since he had nothing, even before Hollywood knew his name, even before the applause became a familiar part of his life. They got married in 1970, when Billy was still just a young man who had not yet shaped his future, and the endurance of this relationship had become one of the rare things that did not change in a world that was always shifting. Janice was not part of Hollywood, not caught up in the lights or fame. She existed as an anchor, a place where Billy could return without needing to play any role, without needing to make anyone laugh, without needing to prove anything. And throughout many decades, amid the movies, the television shows, the big ceremonies, family was always what he tried to hold on to at all costs. Not because he did not love his work, but because he understood clearly how the feeling of losing a loved one could leave such a large void. He had 2 daughters, and for Billy, being a father was not a role that could be prepared for in advance, but a responsibility he approached with all caution, as if every moment he spent with his family was a way to repair something in his own past, a way to ensure that the people he loved would not have to experience the feeling of being left behind that he had known all too well. Between a dense work schedule, trips, long filming sessions, he still tried to arrange time to be with his wife and children, not always perfect, not always able to balance everything, but there was always a clear effort not to let his career swallow the rest of his life. There were times when he had to choose between a big career opportunity and a family moment, between appearing in front of the public and being at home with his loved ones. And those choices were never easy, because each choice carried a price. But Billy understood that there were things that, if lost, could not be regained, and family was one of them. Deep inside, the fear of loss had never left him. It was not loud, not always clearly present, but strong enough to influence the way he lived, the way he loved, and the way he made decisions. He did not talk much about it, did not turn it into a public story, but those close to him could feel it, in the way he tried to keep everything stable, in the way he cherished seemingly small things, in the way he did not see family as a side part of life, but as its center. That did not mean his life had no tensions, no difficult times, because anyone living between two worlds, one side Hollywood with all its pressure and expectations, the other side family with the need for presence and connection, had to face unavoidable conflicts. But Billy did not choose to let go of one side to keep the other. He chose to try to keep both, even when that required more, even when that made him have to sacrifice opportunities or accept limits that others might not understand. In an industry where many relationships broke under the weight of fame and time, the fact that he and Janice remained together after many decades was not by chance, but the result of continuous choices: the choice to stay, the choice to listen, the choice to prioritize things that could not be measured by awards or revenue. And those very choices had created a very different part in Billy Crystal's story. A part that did not appear on screen, was not mentioned in ceremonies, but was the foundation that helped him stand firm through everything life brought. Because when everything else could change, could come and go, could be praised and then forgotten, family was still the only place he did not want to and would not accept losing. But even when family was still there as an anchor, there were moments that Billy Crystal could not bring anyone along for, moments that only existed after the lights went out, after the stage was empty and the rows of seats that had once been full gradually became silent, when the applause no longer rang out and the laughter from just moments before seemed to disappear so quickly it was hard to believe. He left the stage with the same body, the same face, but the feeling inside had changed completely, as if he had just stepped out of a different world. A world where everything was vibrant, where every line was responded to, where his presence had clear meaning, and then in just a few steps it all vanished, leaving a void that nothing filled immediately. Those moments were not always clear to outsiders, because from afar the life of someone like Billy looked complete, full, but it was precisely in that transition from light to darkness that he began to feel more clearly the difference between the person the public saw and the person he had to face when no one was around. On stage, he knew exactly who he was. He had a role, a purpose, immediate feedback from the audience, every laugh, like a confirmation that he was doing it right, that he had value, that he belonged there. But when he returned home, when the room became quiet, when no one was waiting for the next line, other questions began to appear. Not loud, not demanding, but clear enough that he could not ignore them. There were nights when he lay awake longer than usual, not because of work, but because thoughts kept coming back. Memories from the past, images of family, of his father, of the years he had tried to be seen, and even more recent moments when he realized that not everything could be solved with a funny story, that there were emotions that could not be turned into laughter without losing some of their truth. The feeling of emptiness did not come as a shock. It came slowly, slipping into the silences between activities, between trips, between performances, and sometimes even when he was in the middle of a crowd he could still feel it, a distance that was not easy to explain, as if there was a part of him that was not fully present there. This did not mean he did not appreciate what he had, did not mean he was not grateful for his career, for his family, for the opportunities he had received, but it showed that there was another layer in his experience, a layer that not everyone saw, where laughter was no longer the answer to everything, where he had to face things that no audience could help him overcome. Over time, Billy began to understand more clearly the difference between the image he had built and his true self, not as a falsehood, but as a role he had played for so long that sometimes even he forgot the boundary between the two. He knew how to appear, how to speak, how to make people feel comfortable, But that did not always fully reflect what he was feeling inside, and realizing that was not easy, because it forced him to admit that there were parts of himself he had not allowed to appear in front of others. Laughter, the thing that had once saved him, that had helped him through the hardest periods, was still there, still an important part of his life. But it was no longer enough to fill everything, no longer enough to cover every void, no longer enough to keep everything balanced, and this very change made him adjust the way he viewed life, no longer seeing laughter as the only solution, but as a part of a bigger picture, where there was both joy and sadness, both connection and loneliness, both light and the dark spaces he could not avoid. There were evenings when he sat still, without turning on music, without watching anything, just to let the quiet exist. Not because he liked it, but because he began to accept that it was also a part of life, a part he did not need to fill immediately. And in those moments, even if not comfortable, a truth gradually became clearer, that a person is not defined only by what they show to others, but also by the way they face themselves when no one is watching. And Billy, who had spent his whole life standing in the light, was now also learning to sit with the darkness, not to be swallowed by it, but to understand that both were inseparable parts of who he was. In all the silences that Billy Crystal had to face alone, there was one rare thing that kept him from feeling completely alone. That was the presence of Robin Williams, a person who was not just a colleague, not just a fellow artist of the same era, but someone who truly understood what could not be said in words, because he too lived in the same paradox. A person who made the whole world laugh but carried within him dark spaces that few saw. They met not in the noisiest moments of their careers, but in spaces where they could be themselves, where there was no need to perform, no need to maintain an image, where laughter was not a requirement but a choice, and from there a friendship gradually formed, not based on fame or benefits, but on the recognition that both were carrying similar things, just in different forms. They worked together on programs like Comic Relief, stood on stage together with Whoopi Goldberg, raised funds for humanitarian causes, bringing laughter not just as entertainment, but as a way to connect, to help, to turn what they did into something more meaningful. And in those moments, Billy saw not just a friend working with him, but someone who understood his rhythm, understood how he thought, understood when to speak and when to stay silent. But what made this relationship special was not in the times they stood in front of the public, but in the times when no one was around. The conversations without cameras, without an audience, where they could talk about things they could not say elsewhere. About the pressure of always having to be cheerful, about the feeling of being trapped in the image others expected, about the sleepless nights when questions returned without clear answers. Billy realized that Robin not only listened to him but truly understood, without needing long explanations, without needing to hide, because what Billy was feeling also existed in Robin, just expressed in a different way, and that empathy created a space he rarely found elsewhere, a space where he did not need to become Billy Crystal of the stage, but just Billy, a human being with all his contradictions, his fears, his unresolved memories. There were times when they just sat together, talking about very ordinary things, but that very ordinariness brought a sense of relief, because in their world, where everything was often exaggerated, where every emotion tended to turn into performance, having a moment where nothing needed to be done, nothing needed to be proven, became precious. Robin, with his quick wit, his almost uncontrollable energy on stage, had a depth that Billy could recognize immediately, a sensitivity that not everyone saw, and that made Billy feel closer, because he saw in it a part of himself, a part he often had to keep hidden. In an industry where relationships often came and went with projects, with opportunities, this friendship was not bound by those factors. It existed as something stable, an unofficial but very real anchor. And Billy, though he did not say much, knew that he had someone he could trust, someone he could turn to when things became overwhelming without needing to explain too much. Not everyone in life gets that, especially in an environment like Hollywood, where loneliness is often hidden very skillfully. And so Robin's presence became an important part of Billy's life, not because he could not live without it, but because it made living feel lighter, more understandable, less lonely. And perhaps among all the successes, the awards, the applause he had received, having someone who truly understood him, not because of what he had achieved, but because of who he was as a person, was one of the rarest things he treasured most, because it did not come from the lights, did not come from the audience, but from a very human, very simple connection that was deep enough to stay, even when everything else could change. Then one day, the thing that Billy Crystal had never really been ready to face happened in the cruelest way. The news of Robin Williams' passing spread like a shock, not only to Hollywood, but to the entire world. But for Billy, it was not just news, it was a void that appeared immediately in his life, a void that could not be filled with words or memories. Because the person he could once call, could once meet, could once share things no one else understood was no longer there. There are losses that people can prepare for, can gradually accept, but this was not one of them. It came too fast, too unexpectedly, and left a feeling that Billy could not fully describe, a silence deeper than any silence he had ever experienced after the stage, because this time the silence was not just the absence of an audience, but the absence of a familiar voice on the other end of the line, the absence of someone who could understand him in the way he had grown used to. When standing in front of the public to deliver a eulogy, Billy was no longer the host, no longer the one bringing laughter. He stood there, as a friend, trying to find words for a pain that had no structure, no script. His speech was not a performance, but a moment so real that listeners could not keep their distance, because in every sentence one could feel that he was not only talking about a great artist, but about a part of his own life that had vanished. He mentioned the memories, the moments they had shared together, the things only they understood. And in the way he spoke there was no embellishment, no perfect control, like when he stood on stage. Only a sincerity that made everyone realize that behind all the laughter they had seen, there were relationships so deep that when lost, they could not be replaced by anything else. Robin's passing forced Billy to face a truth he may have known for a long time, but had never felt so clearly, that even the seemingly strongest people, the ones who brought joy to millions, also had their own battles that not everyone saw, and that making others laugh did not mean you yourself did not hurt, did not mean you were exempt from the dark corners of life. For Billy, this was not only a personal loss, but a profound reminder that nothing is certain, that even the strongest connections can be cut at any moment, and that time does not stop to let you prepare. After that moment, something inside him changed, not in a way outsiders could easily notice. He still worked, still appeared, still maintained the image the public was familiar with, but inside the way he looked at everything had shifted. He no longer saw laughter as an absolute shield, no longer believed that simply bringing joy to others was enough to keep everything stable. Because he had seen clearly that there were things laughter could not reach, pains that even the best at making others forget reality could not escape. The nights after that became different, not because he had never experienced silence before, but because now the silence carried a different meaning. It reminded him of a person who was no longer there, of conversations that would never continue, of a presence that had once been so familiar now existing only in memory, and Billy had to learn to live with that, not by forgetting, but by accepting that a part of his life would always be tied to this loss. There were moments when he remembered the times they stood on stage together, the times they worked together, and realized that those were not just memories, but pieces that had helped make him the person he was now. And when one piece disappeared, the picture no longer looked the same, even though it continued to exist. This did not stop him, did not make him leave the path he had been on, but it made each step a little heavier, each laugh carry more meaning. Not just joy, but also appreciation. a way to hold on to what was no longer there, a way to keep connecting with a part of life he did not want to lose completely. And in all of that, there was a realization that gradually became clearer than ever, that life is not about avoiding loss, but about learning to live with it. That laughter cannot always save you from pain, but it can help you continue one day at a time, even when you know that some things will never be the same again. After that loss, the rhythm of Billy Crystal's life seemed to slow down in a way he could not control, not because he wanted to stop, but because his body and time began to speak of things he could previously ignore. Old age did not arrive as a clear milestone, but came little by little, through mornings when he felt his body heavier, through nights when sleep was no longer as deep as before, through moments when he realized he needed more time to recover after trips and long work sessions, and even though he still kept his spirit, still kept his sharpness, and storytelling ability that people loved, he could not deny that everything was changing. Not only his body, but the world around him was also gradually becoming different. The people who had walked with him through the important years of his career, the familiar faces on film sets, on stages, in meetings, gradually no longer appeared. Each year that passed brought another new name that left, and with each such time the feeling of loss was no longer an isolated shock but became a continuous chain, as if time was quietly shrinking the circle of people he had once known, once worked with, once shared part of his life with. This not only made him sad, but also made him more aware of his own place in that flow, that he was not outside this rule, that one day he too would become part of memory for others, just as he was remembering those who had left. The feeling that time was passing faster was no longer an abstract concept. It became very concrete through looking back at the years that had passed, realizing that things that once felt close had now receded far, that moments he once thought were recent had actually been decades away from him. And in that realization, there was a change in the way he viewed life, no longer about pursuing more things, but about understanding more clearly what he already had. He began to pay more attention to the small things, the everyday moments, the conversations without a clear purpose, because he understood that those were the things that would stay longest in memory. Not the rounds of applause or the big ceremonies, but the simple seconds that before he might not have given enough attention. Facing the reality that everything has limits was not an easy process, especially for someone who had grown used to controlling the stage, controlling the rhythm of the story. But life does not work that way. It does not allow you to edit, does not allow you to replay, and Billy had to learn to accept that, not by surrender, but by an adjustment, a new way of looking where he no longer tried to keep everything as before, but allowed it to change in its natural way. This did not mean he no longer felt regret, no longer had moments when he wished everything could slow down, that those who had left could stay longer, but he began to understand that holding on to things that could not be held only made the journey heavier, and instead he chose to carry them in memory as a part of himself, as something that had not completely disappeared, but had simply transformed into another form. In these days and months, Billy no longer chased the pace he had once been familiar with, no longer tried to prove anything to the world, but focused more on being present in what he had, whether it was a quiet evening, a conversation with family, or simply a moment when he sat back and thought about everything that had passed. And in that slowing down, there was another kind of peace that began to appear. Not the explosive joy like on stage, but a quiet acceptance, an understanding that life does not always need to be full to have meaning, that even in loss there can still exist a way to continue, not by forgetting, but by living with everything he had been through. From that acceptance, Billy Crystal's life gradually shifted to a different rhythm, no longer rushed, no longer driven by dense schedules or expectations to always appear in front of the public, but became slower, quieter in a way he might not have imagined before. His days no longer revolved around preparing for a big performance or an important event, but revolved around simpler, closer things. Unhurried mornings, meals with family, conversations uninterrupted by work or phone calls. And it was precisely in those seemingly small things that he began to find a form of value that before might have been overshadowed by the fast pace of his career. Family, the thing he had tried to preserve for many decades, was now not only an anchor, but became the center of daily life, a place where he could be fully present without being pulled away by outside demands, where he did not need to be someone who brought laughter to millions, but simply a husband, a father, a grandfather, roles that required no stage but carried deeper meaning than any role he had ever played. In this change, there was a clear choice, not to abandon his career, but to adjust the way he approached it, no longer chasing fame or attention as before, no longer feeling the need to prove that he still belonged at the center of the industry because he had passed that stage, had achieved things many people dream of, and now what he sought was no longer recognition but balance. This showed in the way he chose work. Not every project needed to be accepted, not every opportunity needed to be seized, but only those that truly meant something to him were kept. Projects that allowed him to tell stories he believed in, work that did not require him to trade away what was more important in his personal life. Everyday moments, things that before he might have just passed by, now became clearer. An afternoon sitting with family, a small laugh in a room with no cameras, a memory recalled without needing to turn it into a perfect story. All of those gradually became highlights in his day, not loud, not needing recognition, but enough to create a feeling of fullness that did not depend on lights or audiences. This did not mean he no longer loved his work, no longer felt attached to the art, but that he continued working in a different way, gentler, more selective, more suited to the stage of life he was in, where each project was no longer a step forward in his career, but part of a longer journey, where he could carry everything he had been through, both joy and sadness, to tell stories with more depth, more truth. In this new rhythm, Billy was no longer defined by what he did on stage, but by the way he lived when there was no stage, the way he was present in moments no one saw, the way he cherished what remained instead of regretting what had passed. And even though there were times he still remembered the brilliant years, still felt a little emptiness when thinking about things that were no longer there, he did not let those emotions take up all the space but placed them in their proper place as part of the past, as part of who he was, but not the whole. His life was no longer noisy like before, but in that quiet there was another form of fullness, a form that did not need applause to confirm it, did not need lights to exist, only real presence in every moment. And perhaps after everything he had been through, that was exactly what he had been searching for a very long time, a life that did not need to be grand to have meaning, did not need to be seen to be real, only to be lived fully in his own way. When the rhythm of life had slowed down enough to see more clearly what lay behind, Billy Crystal began to look back at his entire journey, not to tally achievements, but to understand what truly remained after all. Because if there was one thing time taught him, it was that no matter how brilliant something was, it would eventually calm down. Every light would eventually go out, and what remained was not always the things that had been praised the most. He remembered the early days standing on small stages when no one knew who he was, when every laugh was an effort. Remembered the first roles, the appearances when no one was sure if he would be invited back, and then looked to the bigger moments. Films like When Harry Met Sally, that had become part of popular culture, the Times hosting the Academy Awards, where he not only fulfilled a role but created memories that audiences would recall many years later. Moments when he not only made others laugh, but made them feel connected to one another. And when looking back, he realized that the value of those things did not lie in numbers, did not lie in how much the film earned or how many people watched the show, but in the way they existed in other people's memories, the way a line could be quoted in a conversation, The way a movie scene could become part of how people understood love. The way a humorous moment could ease someone's difficult day whom he would never meet. That was a form of influence not easy to measure, but far more lasting than what could be recorded by awards. And it was in that realization that he began to see his career in a different way, not as a series of successes that needed to be maintained, but as a collection of connections he had created with others, connections that were not loud but deep enough to last. Younger artists, people who grew up watching him on screen, had carried a part of his style into their own work, not by copying, but by understanding that humor was not only about making others laugh, but about saying something true, something human. And Billy, even though he did not stand before them as an official teacher, still became a point of reference, an example of how one could exist in this industry without losing oneself. This did not come from him trying to create a legacy, but from the way he worked, the way he kept his stories honest, the way he did not turn himself into a version he did not recognize just to fit expectations. When the lights no longer shone on him as before, when the big ceremonies were no longer a regular part of life, the question of what remained became clearer, and the answer did not lie in what he owned, but in what he had left in the hearts of others. The laughs still remembered, the stories still retold, the emotions still evoked when someone rewatched a film or recalled a moment he had created. There was a shift in the way he understood value, from being recognized to being felt, from being seen to being remembered. And that shift did not diminish what he had achieved, but made it more meaningful, because it no longer depended on the moment or current attention, but existed as part of collective memory, part of the stories people carried in their own lives. When everything gradually settled, when the loud sounds no longer dominated, what remained was often the more subtle things, moments that did not need to be emphasized, emotions that did not need to be explained. And Billy, in this stage of his life, seemed to have accepted that, no longer trying to keep everything as before, but letting them become what they truly were. Pieces of a long journey where each part, big or small, had its place. And in everything that had passed, perhaps the most remarkable thing was not how far he had gone, but the way he had gone. The way he had held on to what was important, the way he had allowed himself to change without losing his core. And when the lights went out, when the stage was empty, when no one called his name at a ceremony, those things still remained, not loud, not showy, but clear enough for him to know that his journey, with all its ups and downs, had left something meaningful, not because it was big, but because it was true. And when looking back at that entire journey, from the little boy in the fragile house full of music in Long Beach to the 78-year-old man sitting in the quiet of the present, Billy Crystal is not a story of perfection, but a story of continuing to move forward even when nothing guarantees that everything will be okay. He has gone through losses that no one can avoid, starting from the death of his father when he was still too young to understand, to the voids that stretched for many years after that, then to the friends, colleagues, faces that had been by his side through each phase of life, gradually leaving in ways he could not stop. Each time, not just an isolated loss, but a reminder that nothing exists forever, that everything, no matter how important, can disappear before we are ready. And throughout that journey, he chose a way to exist, not by denying the pain, but by carrying it with him, turning it into a part of who he was, a part he did not display in public, but that was always present in the way he saw the world, in the way he told stories, in the way he made others laugh. Laughter, for him, had never been just a skill or a professional tool, but a way to keep himself from collapsing completely, a way to create light in times when darkness could take over everything. And even though that light was not always strong enough to erase it all, it was enough for him to continue, enough for him not to stop. What is remarkable is not how many successes he achieved, but what he managed to keep during that process. a family he did not let slip away, even as the world around him kept changing, an ability to connect with others that was not worn down by fame, and a honesty with himself even when it was not always easy. He is not someone without moments of weakness, not someone who always knows exactly what he is doing, but someone who has learned to live with uncertainty, with questions that have no clear answers, and still continues to move forward. In his image, there is no glamour of a perfect ending, no moment when everything becomes complete and there is nothing left to worry about, but only a continuation, a flow of which he is still a part, even though the pace has changed, even though the roles have shifted. And perhaps what makes Billy Crystal's story touch others is not what he did on stage, but the way he exists when there is no stage, the way he keeps his smile even when it is no longer as easy as before, the way he accepts that life can be both beautiful and painful at the same time, and does not try to choose one over the other. When all the loud sounds have settled, when the rounds of applause are only memories, what remains is not complete silence, but a feeling that is both sad and warm, an appreciation for what has been, for the people who have passed through his life, and for the person he has become, not perfect, not invincible, but resilient enough to keep smiling even when it still hurts sometimes. The story of Billy Crystal is not a brilliant heroic epic, but like a long, melancholic piece of music stretching across many decades, where every note carries memories and losses he has never truly overcome completely. From the moment at 15 when his father passed away suddenly, leaving a void that could not be filled, to the years he stood on small stages using laughter to keep himself from collapsing, and then reaching the peak with When Harry Met Sally, and hosting the Academy Awards multiple times, all of it shows a painful paradox. The more he made others laugh, the more he had to hide what he was carrying. Especially, Robin Williams' passing was not just an event, but the moment that completely broke the shell he had built throughout his life, forcing him to face the truth that even those who bring joy to the whole world can collapse in silence. And from then on, the long, empty nights after the stage lights became even heavier. What makes viewers unable to help but feel heartache is that he has never allowed himself to stop, still continues to live, still keeps his family as the only anchor in a world that is always changing, still learns to accept old age as time gradually takes away loved ones. For American audiences, where success is often measured by fame and presence, this story is a powerful reminder that the true value of a person does not lie in how long they stand under the lights, but in how they live when the lights have gone out. That strength is not about never hurting, but about still continuing to move forward even when the pain does not disappear. And that, in a society that always demands strength and positivity, sometimes the bravest thing is to admit that you also have dark spaces, just as Billy Crystal has quietly done throughout his entire life. If the story of Billy Crystal makes you pause for a moment, please hit subscribe to the channel as a way to show appreciation for those who have silently endured behind the laughter that the world sees. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore lives that the light never fully tells.